Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my free at 29 draft. I will also be locking in the free at 29 myself. So this is actually the first draft copy of the team that we have based on the updates that we know. Some things might change over the course of the week, and I will update this draft on the team selection if there are any updates to be made. One of the things that we're sort of looking for, of course, is Aston Villa being in Europe. On top of that, too, we have some updates in terms of Reguilon and his fitness. Otherwise, of course, the position that I'm sitting at right now is, we just jumped back into the top 1,000 in the world thanks to that Bruno Hall versus Everton, and we have locked in a free at 29. And the reason why I've gone for free at 29 myself is because, unfortunately, my team succumbed to a lot of injuries after the wild card, and there was just a lack of, positive upsets in terms of the FA Cup. So when we looked at the results, only having Luton and Nottingham Forest joining the sort of set of fixtures, unfortunately, of course, the punts on United players, the punts on Wolves players didn't necessarily work out. And of course, with injuries to Neto, with injuries to Hwang, with even uncertainty about Pau, my transfers last week basically put myself towards a direction where I was aiming for Gameweek 29 free hit. And here I am with the free hit on 29. The first thing I'd like to talk about is defense, right? And when we look at defense, of course, the first thing to look at would be clean sheet odds within a specific week. And of course, the first thing to mention is that looking at these fixtures, the clean sheet odds across the board are pretty horrible. When we look at teams like, let's say, Brentford, Aston Villa, these are probably still the two teams that we have the most comfort in, just naturally based on their rankings when it comes to expected goals conceded. However, when it comes to this week, of course, the best fixtures probably still are, once again, the Brentford fixture just because it's versus Burnley, or the Spurs fixture, really. And it's very close to Nottingham Forest, Aston Villa, Luton. These are all teams that actually have really good clean sheet odds. And then West Ham, Burnley, and Fulham actually much less so, because of course for Fulham, they have the worst effectively opponent. What I do like about investing into the Brentford defenses, though, even though that their defense has been underperforming a lot, you still have some of the attackers within the fullback positions to invest into. When we talk about the Spurs defense, we just saw a really resolute performance versus Aston Villa. Part of that, of course, was speared on by the fact that McGinn had a red card in the second half of the game. So that made it extremely easy for Spurs to actually go and take that performance towards, a 4-0 win. As far as obviously a team like Nottingham Forest or even Aston Villa and Luton, yes, of course, we've seen very dismaying performances recently, but once again, these are the options or the slim pickings that we have within these teams. I think Luton, of course, when we're looking at, fullbacks from this team, Doughty is one of those options to think about. With Aston Villa, unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty because we've seen a lot of rotation between Moreno and Dean. Both of those players have been substituted at 58 minutes. Now, Cash, of course, seems to be a player who has locked down a position in the team so far. We've seen some constant substitutions as well. I think he's a little bit of an edge pick where if you really want a fullback for sure, and you want to take that punt with more guarantees than, let's say, a Moreno or Dean would bring you, he is the one player that I think about. With Brentford, as I said, it is Rorslev or it is Reguilon. With Spurs, you have Udogie and Porro, your usual picks, and we really do expect them to play. But the question, of course, always is, with an unlimited budget, which we basically have here because we're not needing City players, we're not needing Liverpool players or Arsenal players, I do think Porro, of course, is outright the best option. So when I'm creating a free hit draft here with the kind of clean sheet odds that we have, yes, of course, Brentford leading the way probably leans me towards Flecken as a goalkeeper. Now, do I trust these odds? Not necessarily, no. The reality is Burnley have been a pretty solid team when it comes to scoring as of late. Datro Fofana himself has been pretty quintessential to that team. And as we know, Brentford have been underperforming a lot, with Flecken chiefly being responsible for that, alongside Nathan Collins and a lot of just individual mistakes over the course of the season, leading to Brentford being one of the worst teams in terms of the gulf between their expected goals conceded and their goals conceded. However, I still think that this is a chance to go with Flecken, because let's say the next few teams in terms of clean sheet odds, you could be looking at, for example, a Nottingham Forest keeper, you could be looking at a Spurs keeper. But as I said, you probably want to take your chances here. Flecken's a good chance. If you don't really want to double up on a defense, I do think it's okay to actually go with potentially, let's say, a Nottingham Forest keeper here. If let's say you're planning to kind of hedge your bets, for example, go for Morris as a striker, then of course it also could make sense to go for a Nottingham Forest goalkeeper too, if you really want that sort of differential. With Spurs, you're basically not going to go for a goalkeeper here because, of course, if you want to maximize, the theoretical point ceiling with Spurs, I really don't think you'd be going for Vicario. With Aston Villa, I mean, you could very well go Emi Martinez, but once again, how often do Villa actually concede that many shots, and do we expect West Ham to be piling on that much pressure? So when I'm thinking about opponents as well, Burnley are a team that actually do, let's say, take a lot of shots, but not necessarily high quality shots. So with that sort of situation, it could be someone like Flecken who does benefit. With the other teams, you could also even argue that the Nottingham Forest goalkeeper could probably also benefit from that, because Luton have also proved to be an extremely attacking team. Now, outside of the goalkeeper, which I would confirm to be Flecken, I think it's very close, as you can see, based on the clean sheet odds. So for me, I think take your pick with the goalkeeper. It's really not going to be the most substantial gain within this game week, because I think a lot of the points really will come from other players, as we're not expecting clean sheets. In terms of defense, so as I said, I would be going with Porro with just the upside of going triple Spurs. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Richarlison will be back. And even if he is back for Game Week 29 and we get confirmation from Ange that he's back, how many minutes are we expecting from Richarlison? I just don't think it's good enough to sort of outright remove Pedro Porro as an option. Now, in terms of attacking fullbacks from the other teams, I think I would still be going with Doughty, because when we actually look at the sort of competing stats with a lot of the other players within the teams that I've mentioned already, unfortunately, none of these defenders actually have really good underlying stats. Doughty, as a set piece taker, is huge, and he will always add that sort of inherent value. I'm recording this video before the Bournemouth vs Luton game is happening. I don't know what's going to happen there, but we've already seen enough from Doughty this season where, despite the Luton defense being awful, we still know that there's a lot of inherent value with him being an attacker. As far as the Brentford fullback, for me, I would obviously go with Reguilon. And the news about Reguilon is slightly uncertain at this moment in time, because the last interview that we got from Thomas Frank basically confirmed that he had a small injury that sort of precluded him from being involved within the Arsenal game. And another thing to think about too is that when you think about it from a Brentford perspective, was that really a fixture that they were necessarily intending to win, or, you know, to put all their eggs in that basket? Maybe not. They still played actually reasonably well versus Arsenal. So they actually only kept Arsenal to effectively 1.5 expected goals conceded. And when you contrast that to, for example, the West Ham performance, very hard to sort of understand, of course, what's going on with this Brentford team that can put out performances like that versus West Ham, but then also be pretty resolute versus an Arsenal team who have been battering teams left and right and amassing 5 goals per game. So that's an interesting sort of point of view. I do think I'd be more confident in a player like Reguilon if I knew that he was going to start, because compared to all the options, just based on the football that I've been watching recently, you can see that Reguilon is in extremely advanced positions, right? He's one of those players, like, if you had to compare to other players within the league, like Ait-Nouri, who's very frequently in the box trying to take shots, for example, on the end of crosses and things like that. His underlying stats are also pretty good. They're not necessarily at the level of Doughty or Porro or even Udogis, but good enough when you compare to the peers here. And I think that's why Reguilon is someone who I would take ahead of other picks. And Roerslev would be my default pick outside of that, just because you're looking at basically the next best attacking fullback option from this Brentford team. And so why not go for the competing right back? Now, going forwards, of course, in the midfield, this is probably where we have a little bit more dilemmas. I think the two locked positions right now are Son and Maddison. So yes, of course, you've got options like Werner. Yes, of course, you've got options like Johnson. Yes, of course, maybe Richarlison's back. But when you think about, let's say, maximizing points, and particularly for free hit, I still think I'd rather go with the players who might not even have that high ownership, right? I think what's nice about Maddison now is that his ownership is not particularly high. So if people really wanted to go specifically for just differentials for this game week, Maddison's still going to offer you that differential. Yes, of course, a lot of transfers will go into Maddison, but at the same time, you also know that Maddison isn't necessarily a pick that is going to suddenly become 80% effective ownership overnight. You're still going to benefit from Maddison, and the chances that you get from Maddison is something that I would still benefit with, or I would still enjoy more than, let's say, punting on a Johnson start and hoping that he plays more than 60, 70 minutes, or the same thing with Kulusevski, or the same thing with Werner. So on that basis, I think it does make sense to go with Maddison. It's a non-negotiable for me to go Son and Maddison, and as well as Porro, arguably. But I think with Porro, at least you can extend the argument and say that Udogie is a pretty good third Spurs option if you really wanted to go slightly left field, because of course Porro has around 10% effective ownership based on last week. I'm sure the effective ownership this week is going to be extremely high. And of course, Udogie would be the differential, or Romero. Now, other midfield options are interesting, because you have the option of, let's say, going for someone like Bowen, who ultimately, when we look at, once again, all these teams here, all the players that we have available for selection, without knowing too much about Mbeumo, I don't think we can just guarantee that he's going to play 90 minutes of football. I think Bowen, of course, is the best guarantee here from West Ham. Yes, of course, you can go for Ward-Prowse, who's on penalties. You can also go for Kudus, or you can also go for Paqueta, who will likely also play around 85, 90 minutes of football, right? And what I do like, though, is still at the end, when you compare all three options in terms of the open play players outside of Ward-Prowse, Bowen still is the player who actually leads in terms of underlying stats. So yes, of course, Bowen's going to have higher ownership, but once again, is it worth the sort of upside of being able to go for a differential option at the cost, of course, of going for a player who's less likely to score, less likely to assist? Once again, I don't think so. So in this situation, I would take Bowen. The fourth midfielder that I would actually take, and that's obviously suggests the structure of this draft, is that it is a 3-4-3, and we are going for Gibbs White here because what I like about Gibbs White is that we still think that he's going to be the penalty taker for this team. Now, Chris Wood is actually back, and that might change things. But another thing that we've really struggled with Nottingham Forest lately is who's actually guaranteed minutes within this team? Is it Elanga? Is it Hudson-Odoi? Or is it someone like Gibbs White? What Gibbs White probably presents you is the most guaranteed minutes here, and he does have one of the better fixtures this week. So I do like Gibbs White in this scenario. We do expect him to take penalties. Maybe not over Chris Wood, but the last time we saw a penalty, it was actually through Gibbs White. So that is a positive. And that's why I also think based on, for example, the Elanga, starting off the bench in the previous fixture in Gameweek 28 here, and then also the possibility that that could really happen to someone like Hudson-Odoi as well, is part of the reason why I'm actually not considering other options outside of someone like Gibbs White. Yes, of course, they didn't really look electric at all versus a team like Brighton, but we also have to say that this Brighton team at various points in the season have looked pretty well. Hudson-Odoi also, I think, started on the bench, for example, versus Brighton. So on that basis, I think it does make sense still to go with Gibbs White. What it also points out to, though, however, is that Chris Wood is quite an interesting attacking option. And I think if you're more minded towards going for, let's say, Chris Wood as your third striker potentially, you could just simply move out of, let's say, the business of going for a Nottingham Forest defender or midfielder, and you can instead move into someone like Leon Bailey as well. For me, he would be my fifth favorite midfielder. I probably wouldn't actually go for a Nottingham Forest midfielder if it wasn't for Gibbs White, just because he has some of these intangibles, right? Set pieces, penalties at times, and unfortunately, if you can't guarantee starts and minutes really within the Nottingham Forest midfielders, why not go for someone like Bailey? The downside with someone like Bailey, unfortunately, is that I still think you're looking at someone who's going to be playing versus Ajax on Thursday. And the turnaround there will also probably give us a lot of understanding of who's actually going to play within that West Ham versus Aston Villa match, because we could see, for example, Diaby start versus West Ham. I don't think that's a crazy situation. Let's say if you think that the priority is going to be to go all out once again versus Ajax, to have players like McGinn play, to have players like Diaby play, who would be, or rather Bailey, who would be first choice to play, then maybe actually what you'll see is a little bit more rotation from Unai Emery, given that the sort of first string team also didn't play particularly well versus Tottenham. So why not give opportunities and a chance to rotate, which is why I don't really like Bailey for the purposes of this West Ham versus Aston Villa match, nor do I really like some of their defenders. As I said, Cash is actually probably the most interesting one because you don't have purely, I think, just the upshot of, let's say, clean sheets, which are already extremely low in terms of Aston Villa's percentages, but you at least have an attacker to sort of offset that cost the same way Doughty would do, the same way Porro would do, or the same way Reguilon would do. So going back to, for example, the midfield, I like Gibbs White for now. I think he's a safer pick, but that doesn't necessarily mean bad. He's also going to be an extremely sort of low owned differential. Not many people own Gibbs White. Instead, more people actually own Gibbs White, or rather Elanga and players like Kudus as well. You could also be looking at someone like a Barkley. But when we actually talk about in isolation, just this fixture, I think you're going to expect more from the Nottingham Forest team than, let's say, this Luton team. And of course, we could change our mind once again after Luton plays first Bournemouth, but right now, that's sort of how I would rate things. I would even potentially prefer a Douglas Luiz over a Bailey, because I'd expect that Douglas Luiz will play once again 90 minutes versus West Ham, as opposed to Bailey playing, let's say, 80 minutes versus West Ham. So that's something to think about as well. And that's why I've sort of cooled off on players like Elanga. And when we look at, for example, Fulham midfielders too, the matchup for me is a little bit too bad. And then also, we just don't have guarantees in terms of players like Andreas and Willian. At the same time, of course, someone like Iwobi, who we'd probably expect to start and play more minutes, do you really want to be going that far left field for a pick? Probably not. And at the same time, one of the players I neglected was James Ward-Prowse. If I was to, let's say, compare James Ward-Prowse and Gibbs White, one of the things I'd mention, of course, is that they're very similar players. And actually, the fixture in terms of, let's say, Aston Villa versus, let's say, Gibbs White's opponent in Luton just makes me edge towards someone like Gibbs White. And I like the idea as well of spreading your risk as well within a free hit. You're ultimately hedging over 4 fixtures. You probably want diversified outcomes. You want different sort of routes towards points, even though, of course, I mean, betting, for example, towards a specific result is always something that a lot of people intuitively like to do. But I think if you can cover yourself with multiple situations, we know that there are multiple ways to get towards getting FPL points anyways. I'd prefer going for a Gibbs White in this situation if you were faced between the choice of going for James Ward-Prowse and Gibbs White. As far as the forward line here, as I said, we're going for a 3-4-3. And what's interesting here is that I think that two of the options are non-negotiable, but arguably for most of the people, only one option is non-negotiable. And that one non-negotiable is going to be Watkins, first of all. And the second of all would be Toney. Now, one of the interesting things about Toney recently is that, as I've mentioned within my own videos, and partially why I've gone into, let's say, a free at 29 strategy, is that he has had extremely unappealing fixtures, and or rather not fixtures, but just performances so far when it comes to the underlying stats and when it comes to the outcome, just goals and assists simply, which is what we expect from Toney. Unfortunately, of course, after his red hot start, we've seen very little in the Arsenal game, which of course is not even a fair judgment on a player, but 0.06 expected goal involvement, so very, very low once again. And if you extend back to the last few games where actually his goal scoring odds were pretty good, when you look at, for example, gambling odds, he just hasn't really delivered anywhere what we expect when it comes to underlying stats. On the other hand, Wiese has played very well, but we also know that Wiese is prone to being an early substitution at times, and that's a little bit worrisome because, of course, we can always see that Mopé could let's say, step up and actually play a fixture. However, Wiese, I think, is doing so well that it's hard to believe that Wiese is going to be on the bench. So if you really want to go for, let's say, one of the Brentford picks here versus Burnley, which, of course, is one of the teams to target, and you want to maximize on triple Brentford, for example, I do think Wiese is a player that you can go with if you really want to go left field to Toney. But what I like about Toney at the end of the day is he is a penalty taker. And we look at a team like Burnley where you're not expecting the defense to be particularly good. Why not go with a pick who can actually give you, more routes towards points, free kicks, things like that, or even, once again, penalties with Toney. So that's why I like Toney, and I think for me, he's a non-negotiable, but you might change your mind on that. And the third forward is going to be another topic of discussion because just like we talked about how some of the Fulham picks are not very interesting, I think one of the interesting picks, of course, is going to be Muniz, right? And Muniz is interesting because right now you still don't really have players who can actually replace him in the short term, in that they don't really have that much centre forward depth outside of Armando Broja. And with Broja, of course, he did actually come on in the previous game, got an assist versus Wolves, but actually Muniz was still on the field because this Fulham team were chasing. I suppose the question that I'd be asking myself is next week is there a chance, for example, that let's say if Fulham are doing well, that Muniz would come off and that Broja would come on? Is that possible? Very unlikely, of course, because we're expecting for this Tottenham team to do well, and therefore Fulham would probably be in a position where they're chasing. So you're probably going to expect 90 minutes from Muniz. However, what are the competing picks? You've got Chris Wood, who's just come back and literally played 90 minutes coming back, already getting more minutes than Awoniyi usually would within any week. And on top of that, he potentially could be on penalties over Gibbs White. It's hard to sort of judge where the penalties actually lie with this Nottingham Forest team. And if you, let's say, have an inkling in terms of who's on penalties, I would actually definitely side with that player. Because let's say if you think Chris Wood is on penalties, then Gibbs White is also invalidated as a pick as well in the midfield, in my opinion. You can move towards instead someone like a Bailey or a Douglas Luiz. At the same time, though, when we talk about, let's say, Chris Wood, he might not be on penalties, and therefore it might make more sense to actually side with another forward who we know is going to play 90 minutes most likely, like a Morris, who would actually probably benefit in this situation because he would be a confirmed penalty taker and you'd just be extending another penalty taker within your draft. We have two other players in terms of Fofana as well, but I think once again, it really just depends on how low you are on this Brentford team. Do you really think that they're going to continuously underperform? Do you think that this Burnley team, for example, will be able to step up versus a team like Brentford? That's very probable. But I think, once again, if I was to go with, let's say, goal scoring odds, it seems like it's actually leaning towards Morris once again. And Muniz is very, very close to Morris. So those are the two picks that I'd be looking at alongside Chris Wood. And then Dacho Fofana would be an extremely sort of interesting differential you could potentially go for. Werner, of course, is a striker from the Spurs team, but do you really want to go for Werner, given that, for example, he's been on the bench at times? I don't think so. And I don't think it's worth, for example, throwing away your chance at 3 perfectly good Spurs assets just to take a punt on a third forward when you can actually already take a punt within one of the players that I've mentioned. So on that basis, with all these things sort of being considered, I would like to go for Chris Wood because I still think that when I look at fixtures and I look intuitively at how bad this Luton defense have been at times, I do want to go for a forward here. I do want to go for a Chris Wood, and I think it would make a lot of sense to go for Chris Wood. The question that I find myself asking, though, is do I really want to go for Chris Wood and Gibbs White? Potentially not. I think what I would do is probably either go Gibbs White and Morris as a pair, or I would go for Chris Wood and probably Lucas Paqueta as a pair as well. Now, this would make me a little bit more hedged towards West Ham, which is odd because actually you'd expect Aston Villa to do better within this fixture, but keep in mind as well, they're coming back from a European game, and so would West Ham. So one of the things that we do need to monitor is, how West Ham develop in their game versus Freiburg, how Aston Villa develop on their game versus Ajax, and maybe we can revisit that sort of question of who that fourth midfielder would be. Right now, I think what I'd be locked in with is, as I said, going to be Morris and Gibbs-White. I think Chris Wood is the player that I would go with if I was confident that he was on penalties over Gibbs-White. But I think that you have the most amount of guarantees here in terms of minutes. And this is a free hit draft that I quite like. Option 2, as I said, is going to be your Chris Wood plus Lucas Paqueta or Bailey. And we have to sort of make that decision closer towards the deadline. But these are sort of the options that you're really facing with right now, almost as a draft guide for this week in Free at 29. Outside of that, of course, I think you can go for much more left field options. But once again, you run the risk of questioning whether you're going for a pick just purely because it's an extremely low-owned pick, or whether you're actually going for a pick because you actually think that there's a bit of upside there and there's a chance to get some potential, points that many people won't own for this game week, with good reason. So as I said, Muniz is a good example of that. Fofana potentially is a good example of that as well. But I think that's pretty much where it ends, because unfortunately, I wouldn't be looking, for example, for a Burnley midfielder. I wouldn't necessarily be looking for any other picks when it comes down to, let's say, a Fulham midfielder as well. So those are my thoughts in terms of this game week. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and good luck with your free at 29 drafts. Let me know if you have any ideas in terms of your game week 29 free at drafts. Are you looking potentially for even an Mbumo return and to put him into your team? Let me know. Take care and goodbye.